Welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason. I'll be your host on this CFL talk show, Huskies Huddle. In this video, we take a look into the 2022 Saskatchewan Roughriders. But really quickly before we get started, if you want to support the channel, as always, be sure to hit like and subscribe. It's the best way to show your support. And with that said, let's get on with today's agenda. The Saskatchewan Roughriders, really excited to talk about this video today. We're going to start off by talking about their 2021 recap, then talking about their coaching staff that they're going to be bringing in to this season. And then we're going to go into the bulk of the video, which is going to be our 2022 positional rankings, where every position on this team stacks up relative to the rest of the CFL. And then we're going to be looking at their starting lineups, trying to piece together the depth charts for this team because they're very unreliable in the CFL. And then we're going to go into our team award predictions and finally a key storyline / question to look out for this team this year. And with that in mind, let's get into the recap. It was just kind of an interesting season last year for Saskatchewan. I didn't think they played all too great throughout most of the year, but they had a great record for the most part of the season. They were the second best team in the CFL for most of last season. Finished 9-5, hosted a home playoff game, were able to survive a playoff thriller versus Calgary, but ultimately it was the same result as 2019, losing in Winnipeg at the West Final. And with this team, it's going to be really interesting to see how they respond to having that fate for the second straight season. Can they get back there and finish the job and get to the Grey Cup? There's going to be a ton of pressure on this team this year, hosting it this year, and trying to win it again like they did in 2013 on home soil. Now, with that in mind, let's get on to their 2022 coaching staff. Starting with head coach Craig Dickinson, 22-10 record over his first two seasons as a head coach. More of that CEO type head coach, not necessarily the guy that's going to be the guy that will double as an offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator. He actually has a background in special teams, and that's how he got elevated to the job here. But I think he does a really good job in terms of setting the tone for this team, and they just seem like a relatively good coached team the past couple of seasons. They had some problems with penalties here or there last year, but I think Dickinson in general has done a really good job the first couple of seasons here in Saskatchewan. And then he's joined by veteran offensive coordinator Jason Moss, has been a very creative offensive coordinator throughout his time in the league, likes to explore the deep passing game. And then defensive coordinator Jason Shivers, who I think is a potential CFL head coaching candidate over the next couple of seasons because of what he's been able to do with this defense, with the amount of turnover that they've had in certain spots. They were able to get so much out of the talent that they did last season. I think that defense was the main reason why they had success last season. And then finally, special teams coordinator Kent Margery. I don't really know too much about his background, but I think this is a pretty good coaching staff and one that they should be confident in going into this season. Okay, now let's go into our positional rankings, which is going to start with quarterback. And they're going to come in at 6th in the CFL. And with Cody Fajardo, it's really interesting because I think he has all the physical tools to be a CFL star quarterback. And he's a very talented athlete, but honestly, just a very inconsistent passer. And I think that's really what holds him back. When it comes to Fajardo, he's at his best when he's being utilized on quick rhythm passes off of play action. He can also improvise when the play goes off script, capable of hurting the defense with his legs on a consistent basis. But unfortunately, 2021 was more of an off year for him, as it was for many other quarterbacks around the league. One thing that I feel he really struggles with is going through his progressions. On many occasions, he will make his first couple of reads, and then when it isn't there, he'll just automatically take off and run. Doesn't really, scramble around there and keep his eyes down the field. I think it's more of just a reactionary thing. He doesn't go all the way through his progressions. This really happens even at times when there's adequate protection, which it's been a discussion about how Saskatchewan's offensive line has struggled the past couple of seasons, or more so in 2021. But I think that ultimately it's not just because of that offensive line. I think that Fajardo, a lot of the times when he does get good protection, he's bailing from clean pockets, and that's concerning. And then, of course, you have the problem of his inability to hit open receivers down the field. Countless times last year had potential touchdowns, just overthrowing guys. I don't think it's a matter of not having a good enough arm. I think he has plenty of arm strength, but I think that just that touch really needs to return. I didn't really see much of a problem with him back in 2019 in terms of hitting passes down the field, so we'll see if 2021 was kind of just a blip on the radar in that regard. So for me, I think Fajardo has all the physical tools of a great CFL quarterback, but I think that inconsistency as a passer is really what holds him back in this ranking. Now behind him, you have a really inexperienced backup quarterback room, starting with Mason Fine, a second-year pivot from North Texas, who really only saw action in the Roughriders season finale last year. However, there's something to be said about Fine battling his way through a crowded backup quarterback position last season with guys like Paxton Lynch to be the favorite to hold the position this year. One thing about Fine is he brings play extension ability to the table, similar to Fajardo. And then you got Troy Williams, a guy that was recently brought in here as competition. He has familiarity with the CFL game, having been around the CFL since 2019. However, he has only played in 2 CFL games and thrown 3 passes. I believe that was back in 2019 with Edmonton. And then finally, you got a rookie here in Jake Dolegala, who spent plenty of time in the NFL but didn't throw a single pass. He's most notable for spending the entire 2019 season on the Bengals' 53-man roster. He's a very tall passer at 6'7", 242 pounds, and is one of only a few quarterbacks here listed that are coming to camp here for the Roughriders. Now let's move to the backfield with the running backs, which are going to come in at 9th in the CFL. And the reason why this is just there's no guy here that I feel has really carried the load as a full-time running back at the CFL level. You have Jamal Morrow, who featured mostly as a kick returner in his rookie season, and an excellent one at that. But ultimately, I think there's questions about how he's going to transition into being the full-time running back at the CFL level for this team. One thing is that he's an undersized running back at 5'8", so there will be questions about whether or not he's a full-time every down back, but his elite athleticism should allow him to create plenty of big plays this season. And personally, I think Morrow, because he was here last year, will have the first crack at winning this starting job for Saskatchewan. And then Shaq Cooper, an electric athlete at the running back position, he flashed great potential with Edmonton near the end of the 2019 season. I thought he was going to be a breakout star last season when he signed with BC, but he struggled with consistency and physicality, which led to him failing in the full-time role he had there. But Cooper now has a chance to redeem himself with an open competition in the Riders' backfield. And then a couple Canadian guys here, Keenan LaFrance, a dependable veteran backup who can pinch in as a starter at running back and produce on occasion. Other than that, he's going to do the dirty work, such as being a lead blocker or playing on special teams. Albert Awachi, a reliable special teamer who has played in 36 career games for Saskatchewan. And then James Tuck, who comes over from Edmonton as a free agent, more of a fullback type who can occasionally contribute in the passing game. So overall, I think there's guys that could break out this season just because of the inexperience as being full-time starters in the CFL. I just think this group is kind of lacking, and that's why it ranks at 9th in the CFL. Now let's look at some of the running back rookies that could contribute to this team this year, starting with Bruno Labelle, a former 3rd-round pick by the Roughriders in 2020, who comes to the CFL after spending some time with the Arizona Cardinals. Should be interesting to see. He's more of that fullback type body. I believe he's like 6'5", 250. And then after him, Frankie Hickson, a 5'8" running back who played his college football at Liberty. And then Tromaine Pope, another undersized runner who stuck around the NFL for several seasons, playing in 24 career NFL games. He was just recently added to the roster after they made a few cuts and adjustments. So ultimately, keep an eye out for these guys. They could be contributors with that relatively inexperienced running back group, as I just mentioned. Now moving on to a unit I love, and that is the wide receiver room, which is going to come in at 1st in the CFL. And I just think you have a little bit of everything here, especially from the top 4 guys. And we'll start talking about them with Duke Williams, a big physical receiver that also possesses the speed to separate from defenders. He returned to the CFL last season after a couple of years in the NFL, and after taking a few games to get his feet wet, he really came on down the stretch as one of the best receivers in the league. This was on full display in the West Final versus Winnipeg, where he had 4 catches for over 100 yards and a big touchdown. I believe it was like a 60-plus yarder, and he's just one of the best and biggest difference-making players in the league when he's at his best. And then you have Shaq Evans, a very talented receiver who had an extremely difficult 2021 season. After missing most of the season with injuries, he returned for the stretch run of the season and struggled despite earning plenty of targets in the Riders' offense. In 2019, he was one of the very best receivers in all of the CFL, and I personally had him as a top 3 receiver going into the league last year. When he's at his best, he is an elite deep ball threat that can win in contested catch situations. I think a resurgence from Evans is such a key element to getting Cody Fajardo right this season, especially with the way that Evans can succeed in the downfield passing game, which Fajardo really struggled with last year. And then after him, Kyron Moore, a speedy yards after the catch receiver. He unfortunately suffered a season-ending injury last year. He's an important piece for Saskatchewan's offense, creating much of the team's yardage in the short passing game. He's not going to be a guy, despite his speed, that's going to go deep down the field all too often and create huge plays, but he really excels on those little hitch screens, swing out routes, where he can get the ball in his hands and create offense for him, and that's really a key guy when you're playing with Cody Fajardo. And honestly, he fits really well with these other receivers that they have in this receiving core. And then Keon Schaefer-Baker, who's a very well-rounded young receiver that showed a bit of everything during his rookie season. He is a player capable of lining up in the slot or out wide, gaining separation in a number of ways. Saskatchewan also used him a lot in the screen game, where he showed ability to create after the catch. Bottom line, the sky is the limit for Schaefer-Baker as arguably the best Canadian receiver in the CFL already. And then you got Mitchell Picton, a crafty, reliable route runner, but he doesn't really possess that elite athleticism to create big plays on a regular basis. However, he proved himself to be a decent starting option last year with the Roughriders, possessing pretty solid hands and route running ability, and I think that is really what he's going to bring to the table. And then Justin McInnis, a former first-round pick of the Riders back in 2019, he has yet to fully establish himself as a regular contributor on offense as a receiver. He provides the Roughriders with a little bit of a bigger body, so I think he could end up as this team's second Canadian starting receiver. But at the end of the day, I can't really say I'm too confident in a breakthrough for McInnis, as the team has invested major capital in bringing in additional talent at the wide receiver spot the past few off seasons. And then Paul McRoberts, a guy that's been around the team for the past few seasons but has only played in one game. This could finally be his chance to compete for a starting job. Jake Hardy, a veteran special teamer that has never really seen too much action on offense during his career. If he makes this roster, I believe that's what his role is going to be. And then similarly for Wesley Lewis, he's appeared in games with Ottawa over the past 2 years but hasn't really made much of an impact, played more of a special teams role there. But now let's look at the wide receiver rookies that they're bringing to camp this year, starting with Samuel Emelis. He's Saskatchewan's first-round pick from this year's CFL draft out of Louisiana Tech. He possesses yards after the catch ability and was viewed as perhaps the highest ceiling receiver in this year's draft, so it's going to be interesting to see how early he becomes a contributor for this offense. And then Riley Boersma, another pick from this year, an 8th round pick in this year's draft out of Regina. He really shined in the testing aspect at this year's combine, but he's an undersized guy, so you question about how he's going to translate to the CFL game. And then Jonathan Johnson, a former SEC All-Freshman while at Missouri, who was known for making big plays. Jacob Prawl, who played his college football at Brown, an Ivy League school. Tevin Jones, a 5-year NFL veteran who was actually under contract with Saskatchewan for 2021, but was unable to attend training camp. He was most notable in the NFL for his time with the Dallas Cowboys. Xavier Yabusi returns to the Riders after originally being under contract with the team prior to training camp last season. Deuli Aristotle, I'm sorry for butchering that name. He's a 6'4 receiver who played at little-known Bethel University, which I never heard of. Jeremiah Hadel, who played his college football at Texas State and spent some time with the LA Rams in 2021. And then Jester Way, who played his college football at Pitt. Overall, it'll be interesting to see how many of these guys actually make an impact this year. I think there's potential for a few of them too. Now let's go to the trenches with the offensive line, which is going to come in at 8th in the CFL, and this is probably not a huge surprise to Roughriders fans. They did do a little bit in terms of what they did this offseason in terms of potentially making a little bit of an upgrade, but I really don't think there was substantial upgrades brought in to improve this unit. So starting with Dan Clark, who I consider to be the best player in this offensive line group. He has been the linchpin of the Riders' offensive line for years and was their best offensive lineman again last year. He's not the most athletic mover in space, but you'll rarely see him get beaten badly in pass protection. He's getting up there in age, but I still consider him to be by far this team's best offensive lineman. And then Logan Verlin, who was a surprise starter from last season who earned the role through his work in training camp. Verlin had his ups and downs, which is to be expected for a player who saw their first CFL action last year. While I don't think he displayed the elite play strength to grow into one of the best guards in the CFL, he proved to be a solid starting option with a very high floor. And then Evan Johnson, a big free agent addition going into 2021. He was another player that was kind of a mixed bag last season. He played decent enough much of the time, but I don't think he really gave them the physicality up front they were looking for when they brought him in. On the other hand, Johnson was a player I really liked in 2019 when he was with Ottawa, and I think one of his biggest strengths is his movement ability. He is a very effective pulling guard, and I think Saskatchewan would be wise to use that and implement that more in their schemes. So those first three guys, there's not too much of a problem with them. I don't think there's an extreme amount of upside at those guard positions, but I think the problem with this unit is the tackle position, starting with Teron Vaughn, a veteran tackle that missed all of the 2021 season due to an injury. Vaughn is a very solid and competent left tackle when healthy, and Saskatchewan is going to really hope that's still the case this season as they look to shore up things up front. I think he's their potential guy there at left tackle once again, but I mean, there's questions about, again, how he's going to respond after a couple of years off, considering obviously the canceled 2020 season as well. And then Jamal Campbell, a late free agent addition after he was cut by Toronto. He's a Canadian tackle who has shown clear strengths and flaws as a starter the past few seasons. In my opinion, Campbell is a classic power tackle that is most effective as a run blocker. However, his pass protection technique and footwork have been very sloppy at times, which lead him to being beaten very badly on a pretty consistent basis. The thing is, Campbell has games where these pass protection flaws do not show up at all, but unfortunately on a regular basis they do. In bringing Campbell in to most likely be their starter at right tackle, it is important for the people to realize that this won't solve the team's pass protection issues, but what it could do is improve the performance of the ground game that struggled for the most part in 2021, which could in turn really help this offense perform better, get that play action passing game going for Fajardo. And then another competitor for that tackle job in Andrew Lauderdale, a player who started several games at tackle last year for Saskatchewan in his first year in the CFL. I think he is the primary competition with Vaughn for that starting left tackle job. And then Canadian Josiah St. John, he's a former first overall pick in the CFL draft. He hasn't lived up to expectations that many had when he was drafted, but has carved out a nice career as a rotational offensive lineman nonetheless. I wouldn't expect him to suddenly break out to be a starter for this team, but he is a solid 6th offensive lineman on game day. And then Ty Rogers, who played with Ottawa over the past few seasons and showed flashes of being a competent starter at right tackle. He'll provide some competition for Campbell in training camp for that right tackle job. And then Maurice Simba, a 4th round pick in 2019 out of Concordia. He has appeared in exactly one CFL game in his career so far, and I believe that was in 2019. So ultimately, I have questions about those tackle positions and the general upside of this unit, and that's why it ranks at 8th in the CFL. Now looking at the offensive line rookies, starting with the 2 guys that they selected in this year's CFL draft. First, starting with 2nd round pick Zach Fry out of Western, who probably is more of a tackle at the CFL level, doesn't really possess that elite power to play guard, I don't think, but is that guy that has more of that technique and movement ability that I think could translate long term in terms of being a guy that you can develop behind Campbell for that right tackle job. And then Diego Alator Montoya, a 3rd round pick out of UBC. Some of the guys that I was watching the live stream with were very high on this guy because I had never really heard of him. But some people were saying, no, trust me, this guy is good. So I'm excited to watch him this year. And then Connor Klassen and Riley Schick, 2 guys that come out of the Canadian junior football system with the Regina Thunder. Noah Johnson, a 6'1", 293-pound lineman from Kansas State. Cooper Richardson, who played at Sacramento State and UC Davis in college. And then Logan Bandy, who was thought of as a top prospect for the 2021 CFL draft, but on draft night, he fell to the later rounds. He didn't dress for a game in his rookie season after going back to school. And then Tommy Champion, who spent some time on practice squads in the NFL, most notably with the Seattle Seahawks. overall, I think the main contributors for this unit are likely to be those two guys at the top, Fry and Montoya. Now let's flip over to the defensive side, starting with the defensive line, which is going to come in at 6th in the CFL, and I like this defensive line room. Don't get me wrong, I just don't think that, there's that other proven pass rusher that will get them above other teams that I have ranked higher. So starting with AC Leonard, who is an excellent pass rusher, and there's nothing to take away from him. He led the CFL in sacks last year with 11 in 11 games. Leonard consistently wins with quickness off the edge and has the athleticism to occasionally drop back in coverage as a changeup. I wouldn't argue that he is a great run defender, but he will make the odd tackle for loss or splash play here or there. Ultimately, he's one of the most impactful defensive linemen in the CFL and truly established himself as a true #1 pass rusher last season. And then behind him, you got a lot of interesting young pieces here, starting with Keon Adams, a second-year CFL edge rusher who garnered attention going into the last season as a diamond in the rough. He ultimately only played in 9 games and started 4, but he did flash pass rush ability in those opportunities. The key for Adams will be having a good camp as he looks to firmly lock down the starting spot opposite Leonard in the Riders' defense. And then Garrett Marino, a guy that I'm really excited to see play in his second CFL season. It was only 1 season, but Marino showed signs of being a game-wrecking defensive tackle with elite play strength and pass rush upside. However, in order to make good on that potential, he will need to stay healthy after playing in just 7 games last year. But I think when the year is out, it's not very far-fetched to say Marino could be an all-star on the interior. I think he really did flash that high of potential in limited opportunities last year, and I think this could be a potential breakout star for the CFL this season. And then they bring back veteran pass rusher Charleston Hughes, a really good feel-good story here. He's a late add to the training camp roster and one of the most recognizable names in the CFL. Hughes returns to Saskatchewan after spending 2021 in Toronto, where he had perhaps his worst season as a pro. Now 38, Hughes will look to recapture the pass rush form that he had during the 2019 season when he led the CFL in sacks at age 36. One thing's for sure, he will certainly have the motivation as he sits just outside the top 5 all-time career sacks list with 132, and I think he's only like 5 behind the number 5 guy on the all-time list. So really excited to see if he can contribute at all. And then Pete Robertson, another contender for the team's starting edge position. He had a productive rookie season in the CFL last year. He mostly factored in on a rotational basis, but made his impact felt often, even when he wasn't producing sacks. That being said, he did produce well in those opportunities as well, coming away with 5 total sacks. And then Charbel DeBuyer, a Canadian defensive tackle who may figure into the starting lineup after the departure of McConnell Henry in free agency. He's unproven as a starter, but DeBuyer has slowly been brought along the last few seasons and has shown flashes of being a very stout run defender. And then Anthony Lanier, a bigger-bodied edge player who can chip in on inside at defensive tackle. He had some strong stretches of play last season across 10 games. Lanier is capable of pushing the pocket from the inside, which ultimately may be what he is best at the CFL level. And then finally, Nick DeHealy, who spent 2021 with Winnipeg playing in 4 games while playing on special teams. He likely competes here as a backup behind DeBuyer if they intend to start a Canadian defensive lineman. Now looking at the Roughriders defensive line rookies, starting with DeMarcus Christmas, likely more of an interior player at the CFL level at 300 pounds. He played his college football at Florida State for the Seminoles. And then an interesting player here, Benjamin Davis, who played at Alabama before transferring to Texas to play for the Longhorns. So 2 big-time blue blood schools that he played at. And then Kaylon Davis, who played for the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. He's 6'3" and 250 pounds. And then Justin Thomas, who played at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Reese McCormick, who's another former product of the Regina Thunder in the Canadian Junior Football League. David Kenny, a college linebacker at 250 pounds. He's listed on the Riders roster as a defensive lineman. And then these final 2 guys here, Nick Coe, a former Auburn Tiger, who has a defensive tackle build at 6'5", 285 pounds. And Miles Brown, a former Arizona Cardinal, who appeared in 9 games back in 2019. Now looking at the team's linebackers, and they're going to come in at 2nd in the CFL, and I just love this linebacking group. I think you have a lot of experience here and high upside players. Starting with Derek Moncrief, who I consider to be that ideal prototype as a CFL strong side linebacker. He's extremely physical but also very rangy in coverage. After coming back to the CFL midway through last season from the NFL, he starred on a dreadful Elks team and, despite only playing half of the season, was named the team's top defensive player. That goes to show you the quality of player we are talking about, and in my opinion, Moncrief is the best strong side linebacker, big nickel, whatever you want to call it, in the CFL today. And then free agent addition Darnell Sankey, who's a breakout star from 2021 with Calgary. He led the league in tackles as a rookie. He is your classic sideline-to-sideline middle linebacker who is a thumper against the run. I wouldn't say he's one of the more impressive coverage linebackers in the league, but he certainly wasn't a liability in that regard either last year. I'm excited to see if he can follow up that excellent rookie season that he had in 2021. And then Canadian linebacker Micah Teitz, who had a great 2021 season, a breakout season of sorts for him. Teitz, in my opinion, is a very well-rounded linebacker who doesn't really excel in any one aspect. He has good coverage range and instincts in pass coverage, but he's also physical enough to be a factor in stopping the run as well. So overall, I think he's a very capable starting option in this linebacking core and a guy that will provide a little bit of upside for you as well. And then Larry Dean, a very interesting player who missed all of the 2021 season after suffering a torn Achilles tendon the day before training camp was scheduled to start. Back in 2019 and previously, Dean was one of the most feared linebackers in the entire CFL, capable of occupying the middle of a defense as a rangy middle linebacker. However, with Saskatchewan's linebacker situation, the question will be whether or not there is a place in the starting lineup for Dean. It will be fascinating to see how they utilize these four linebackers this year. And then you have some interesting depth guys here, starting with Canadian Justin Herdman-Reid, who's a player who saw some starting action in the CFL previously and signed with Saskatchewan in 2021 free agency, but had a relatively quiet season sitting behind Teitz on the depth chart. Gary Johnson, who appeared in 8 games over the past 2 seasons with the Riders but has yet to start a game. Nigel Harris, who appeared in 6 games last season as a rookie. Michael Pinckney, who played in 3 games last season and had a little bit of production with 6 total tackles. And then Alvin Jones, who played in 1 game in his CFL rookie season in 2021. Let's see if there's a bigger role for him or any of these guys this year. Now with that in mind, let's look at the few rookie linebackers that they have coming to camp this year, starting with Justice Momoka, a Canadian guy who comes from the University of Alberta, who signed with the Riders as an undrafted free agent. AJ Allen, a 4th round pick from 2020 out of Guelph, who returned to school in 2021 for his 5th year of eligibility in U Sports. Connor Johnson, which should have an asterisk here because he's a Canadian guy here. He's a territorial junior player who played in the CGFL for the Saskatoon Hilltops. And then finally, Tommy Bringy, a linebacker who was selected recently in the CFL draft out of Laurier in the 4th round. Now looking at one of the more interesting units on this team with the defensive back room, which is going to come in at 5th in the CFL, and I'm very split on this defensive back room because on one hand, you have a couple of really experienced players that are proven in the CFL, but then you have a lot of inexperienced but promising players, I think, in the back half of this unit. So we'll start with the most notable guy here, and that's Nick Marshall, boundary corner who is known for being a risk taker. His 2021 season was a mixed bag despite a West Division All-Star nod. Marshall will always produce a handful of splash plays every season and is always a threat to take it the distance once he gets the ball in his hands off of a turnover. However, in the past couple of seasons, especially in 2021, he consistently had coverage lapses that led to big plays. For that reason, Marshall was one of the most difficult defensive backs in the CFL to gauge going into this year. And then veteran Mike Edom, a Canadian safety who struggled with injuries in 2021. Edom is a really solid veteran that you can trust as a starter at free safety. Edom's coverage skills are solid, but I think where he really shines is his ability to be deployed close to the line of scrimmage, whether that be coming on the blitz or stopping the run. Coming off a season of injuries, we'll have to see how Edom responds, but he should be safely one of Saskatchewan's Canadian starters. Then after those first 2 guys, the experience really drops off as they've lost a lot of veterans here the last couple of years in free agency. One of these young guys that is trying to carve out a bigger role with this team next year is Blaise Brown, a promising second-year defensive back who held his own in the starting lineup as a rookie before missing the second half of the season due to injury. And then Jeremy Clark, a former Michigan Wolverine who had flashes after being pressed into a starting role last season, including the playoffs. He started at the field corner spot and largely held his own. And then Damon Webb, who broke into the starting lineup late last season. Webb was particularly impressive in the matchups with Calgary last season. I think he came away with a couple of picks in that one game. So he's a guy that played his college football at Ohio State and will look to establish himself as a full-time starter to begin 2022, like Brown and Clark. And then an interesting player here in AJ Hendy, a player who left the team midway through last season after a dispute over playing time. But he was ultimately brought back this offseason after the team lost veterans in the secondary. Hendy showed good positional versatility in his brief action, playing some halfback and strong side linebacker. And then Canadian defensive back Godfrey Onyeka, a 3-year veteran out of Wilfrid Laurier, he figured into the team's starting lineup at times last season. Due to a relatively physical profile for a defensive back, he has been featured at strong side linebacker when given opportunities on defense. And then Roland Milligan, who started the regular season finale versus Hamilton, but also dressed for the Riders' 2 playoff games. He played his college football at Toledo. So ultimately, I think this unit is light on experience, but I give them the benefit of the doubt because they've done a really good job with defensive backs over the past couple of years. They still have a couple veterans here to coach them along. And I think I liked what I saw from Brown, Clark, and Webb, and a little bit from Hendy last year. Now looking at the enormous list of defensive back rookies, and I'm just honestly, I'm going to go through this as fast as possible for you guys because this list is just ridiculously long. But I'm going to give special mention to our first guy here, Nelson Lacombo, who was the 2nd overall pick in the 2021 CFL draft and tore his Achilles tendon before training camp last season. But prior to his injury, Lacombo was seen as a player capable of making an impact as a starting DB or linebacker in the CFL. Just seen as a guy that was a potential ratio breaker, if you will. Expectations should be tempered given the extent of his injury, but it's exciting to hear he'll be ready for training camp. And now we're just going to fire the rest of these guys off as quickly as possible, starting with Jaden Dalkey, a mid-round pick in this year's draft out of Alberta, but actually appeared on the Scouting Bureau top 20 rankings a couple of times. Tristan Fleury, a 6'2 defensive back from McGill. Zach Herzog, a late-round pick from this draft from Hillsdale College. Brian Cole, a former 7th-round draft pick in the NFL by the Minnesota Vikings. He is a product of Mississippi State. Steven Denmark, a 7th-round NFL draft pick who spent time with the Bears, Browns, Steelers, and Packers before signing with the Riders. Vincent Dethier, a 5th-round pick in the 2020 CFL draft out of McGill. He was a very productive defensive back at the U Sports level. Amari Henderson, who played his college football for the Wake Forest Demon Deacons and has been on a few different NFL practice rosters, including the Jacksonville Jaguars. Kasi Onyeka, a cousin of Godfrey. Kasi played his university football for the Guelph Griffins. Will Sunderland played at Oklahoma and Troy in his college career before signing free agent contracts with Green Bay, Indianapolis, and Seattle. Josh Nurse, who played 2 games with the Jacksonville Jaguars in the NFL. TJ Morrison, a 5'10 defensive back out of Stony Brook. CJ Rivas, who played in 4 games with the Jacksonville Jaguars, so a couple former Jaguars here. And then Levante Taylor, most recently played in the Spring League in 2021. And then finally Matt Watson, a 6th-round pick in 2021 who had a productive U Sports career with the Windsor Lancers and Mount Allison Mounties. So obviously an enormous list, and that shows you that they really want to bring in competition for this spot this season. Now moving on to the final position of our positional rankings with the special teams unit, which is going to come in at first in the CFL, and I really just don't have any complaints about this unit whatsoever. Yeah, you could say they moved on from John Ryan for Kari Vedvik, and I just think that Vedvik was similarly on par, I think, with what Ryan was bringing last season. So, I mean, I think that was an okay move for the Roughriders. I don't think they're losing a lot there by letting Ryan go and bringing in Vedvik. And I think Brett Lawther is an outstanding kicker that gives you a lot of distance as well as consistent accuracy. And then I think this return room is really interesting. You have a couple of options that have seen a lot of action on a CFL field. Kyron Moore and Jamal Morrow. Jamal Morrow, obviously an excellent return man from last season. Going to be interesting to see if he plays that role this year, if he has a heavy role on offense. And Kyron Moore, who has had a long history of being a punt returner. So I think this is a really good special teams unit, and I think it's well deserved for the ranking of first in the CFL. Now you put all those rankings together, and they're going to finish 5th on offense and 4th in defense. Just a solid overall roster. A couple of spots that sink a little bit low, but it's balanced out by the high points of this roster, in my opinion. Now that we've taken a look at this roster, now let's take a look at the projected starting lineup, starting with the offense. The main questions I have on offense come on that offensive line with those 2 tackle positions. I think there could be big competitions for both of those spots. I think Bond and Campbell are your likely starters, but I think they could be overtaken with good camps from other players. Running back, you're going to see a bit of a competition there because there really isn't a solidified guy. I think Morrow and Shaq Cooper are going to be the main competitors there, but maybe a rookie comes in and really impresses in camp. And then at the receiver position, I underline Paul McRoberts because I am not really confident that he's going to be the starter there. I think that it could potentially be a second Canadian. This team started 3 Canadian receivers at times last season. And then finally, I think Logan Ferlin is a guy that is likely going to start, but I think a good camp from somebody else could potentially take that job from him. Now flipping over to the defensive side, and I have a few questions here, especially when it comes to the ratio situation. So I have them starting defensive tackle Charbail DeBayer at defensive tackle, but I am not confident in that whatsoever. I have started Larry Dean at weak side linebacker as well, which I'm not confident in as well. But I figured that if Dean makes this roster, I don't know where he's going to play, like if he's not playing that middle linebacker spot. So I think that potentially he could play that weak side spot. They try to put the 3 best linebackers that they have on the field with Dean, Sankey, and Moncrief, and have Tights as their 4th guy. But I think Tights, having that excellent season that he did last year, it's likely that he does retain that role. I just think that trying to find a role for Dean on this roster was the hardest part, and I think that when he's healthy, I mean, that's a huge question coming off the Achilles injury. I think that he's one of the best linebackers in the game, and I think they're going to find a way to put him into the starting lineup here if he is on this roster. So ultimately, I think that's a big question. They obviously could start Tights at that weak side spot, and wouldn't surprise me one bit. And DeBeer could not start. He could just be a rotational guy like usual. But there are questions there in that front 7. And then in the defensive back room, I think it's going to be a lot of competition for those 3 inexperienced spots. None of these guys have been full-time CFL starters going into seasons before. So I think those 3 spots are really up for grabs. Now wrapping up, let's go to the team award predictions, starting with most outstanding player. And I'm going with wide receiver Duke Williams, who I think is really going to establish himself right away as a top 5 receiver in the CFL once again. And I just think you saw it late last season. He was becoming just a matchup nightmare for opposing defenses, and I think he's going to carry that into this year and be the linchpin of a great offense here in Saskatchewan. Most outstanding defensive player, I'm going with defensive end AC Leonard. I think he is the most dynamic player on this defense, and I think he will have a great season once again this year. Most outstanding Canadian, I'm going with wide receiver Keon Schaefer-Baker, who is a dynamic guy who I think is arguably already the best Canadian receiver in the league. And then most outstanding offensive lineman Dan Clark, who is just a rock up front, has consistently been this team's best offensive lineman over the years. And finally, let's take a look at the team's key question / storyline. And that is, can Cody Fajardo fully utilize these great weapons that he has in the passing game? And what I mean by that is usually deep passes, the ones that he really struggled with last season. He needs to be able to hit those on a more consistent basis to make this a more explosive offense on a week-to-week basis. And I'm really excited to see if he can do this. I think this is the best offense that they've ever had around him. And I think that if that offensive line can hold up and play a little bit above expectations, I think they're going to have a great year offensively. And Fajardo has all the opportunities in the world to have a breakout season and have a similar season to what he had in 2019. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this roster review, ladies and gentlemen. And be sure to let me know what you think about the 2022 Saskatchewan Roughriders going into this season. Where are your expectations at for this team? Home Grey Cup coming up. A lot of pressure on this team going into this year. So let me know down in the comment section. If you want to support the channel, as always, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Aussie's Huddle for more CFL content just like this, ladies and gentlemen. Going to be bringing it to you all season long. And with that said, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.